Is rewriting more difficult than writing from scratch?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as a general rule, I don't like to rewrite. What I'll do is I'll do production polishes just because it is so hard to go in and it's so much harder to get a handle on a character. I mean, to me, the fun part is getting in and reinventing and coming up with those ideas of what the birth of a character. And sort of there are a lot of things that when you get the notes on a rewrite, and it's always a painful process, and I always swear it off and always go back. It's that semantic sort of argument between what's a rewrite and what's a production polish.
Right.
But yeah, it's always harder, man. I mean, I'd always prefer to be the first in on anything, and
Right.
I think just in general, that way you can sort of, it's why I think more times than not, if you look curiously at the movies that have been nominated for Best Oscars, there's not a lot of writers. It's one writer more times than not, and it's that sort of continuity, I think, is where great work comes from. It's sort of, but now it's become such a part of the machinery that, well, we got to get a new writer. I mean, I read scripts that I think are pretty tight, and then I hear about putting a writer on it, which is just a reflexive thing, or it's an egotistical thing to assuage the ego of a director or of an actor who has to have his guy come in and do it.
Right.
But it doesn't help the art, man. And at the end of the day, like, I can justify anything. I can justify somebody rewriting me if it's for the betterment of getting a movie made, of making a good movie. But I think all too often the things, if we can take ego out of Hollywood, how much better would the product be?
You'd have no Hollywood.
You'd have no Hollywood, by the way. There'd be 7 people and they'd all be homeless. But but you'd have good movies, Mike.
Right. What was the last thing you polished? Or what?
There's one that's shooting now at New Line. There's the Amityville Horror. I did a polish on.
Okay, so you've dabbled in horror.
Yeah, I do horror. You know, for me, that's the other thing. I love the idea of having a chainsaw movie on my resume and having a Longest Yard comedy on, because I don't think many people can do that for one. But I also think beyond that, I just like the idea of keeping it interesting like that.
Right.
That's always a challenge. There are always things that come easier to me. I think probably thrillers or action are the one that I least flex the muscles that I should on, the easiest ones to get into. But you also find that you fall into like the same old thing. I knew at one point there was always a point in my script where I had a guy looking in the mirror for whatever reason, because it's like visually it's kind of that masturbatory scene. But you got to be aware of that, man, and you got to go away from it, because there are writers, granted, there are writers in this town who've been doing the same thing for 20 years on projects and making a very good living at it. But to me, that's boring, and it's the death of creativity. The interesting things, the projects that I love, are the ones where I have a little more latitude, where I can go and I'm not confined to whatever is expected in that. At the end of the day, it's all a formula, but it's a formula that you have to rejigger every once in a while.
Have you ever gotten a request to doctor a script and go, I can't help this patient?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there are scripts that are, what I'm amazed by is sometimes you'll get a production polish request on scripts that you're like, they actually want to make this?
Right.
Like, there's no way. For one, it's 2 weeks work, it's a week work. This is like page 1.
Right.
But it's also the political side of it. I used to go in on rewrites or on polishes and say that. And now you realize you just got to go in and say, yeah, it's really good. I like it a lot. And, and then go in and do your work on it, because it's sort of how these execs justify things. So you've got to play their game.
I'm sure the last thing they want to hear is like, why did you greenlight this?
Totally. I mean, that's exactly. And it's such a rare thing to get a green light anyways, that when you do, they probably want to hear the writer come in and go, God, it's fantastic. I just have little parts here and there that I want to correct. And then, you do what you have to do.
Right.
But that's part of the politics that I talked about earlier, that you have to be aware of. You've got to be a political animal. It's the thing that I struggle most with. It's the thing that I'm still learning, that side of it. But it's necessary.
Do you have other people read your work in progress? Do you get feedback from people?
I do. The best relationships I have with producers are the producers that I can give pages to. An act at a time, 10 pages at a time, get the feedback. Now, there's certainly a covenant that comes with that, a trust, a level of, I believe that you're going to give me smart enough notes. I believe that I can give you this thing in a raw, unedited form. But I think the best experiences I've had, including Longest Yard, have been in that sort of situation. Same with the polish work I've done, whether it be on Amityville Horror, on a chainsaw, whatever it is. The ability, especially when you're that close to production date, I think you have to do that. And for me, if it's a situation where it's a producer who doesn't read, and let's face it, they're out there, man.
Right.
There are plenty of those guys who just are known, like, great, if you do your job, they're going to back you. And they have a great, it's just a necessary, again, you're going to have to deal with those guys. But I'm not going to give them scripts, because to them, that's antagonizing them. God forbid they should actually have to read a script.
Right.
So instead, what I'll do is I'll give it to people that I trust in my circle. Some in the business, some out of it. And just get their feedback as I'm going along. But I have to do that, man. It's the only way, because all too often there are things that I convince myself of being absolutely brilliant, and then there's a simple, like, why would he do that?
Right.
And you're like, the whole fortress crumbles. But it's necessary.
How many screenplays did you write before the first one got produced?
There were 12 all told. Well, before, God, Jesus. Yeah, like the 12, including the 12 that I basically like
Right.
tossed and never gave to anyone. A good 15 probably, something like in that.
So you were whacking away at it pretty good.
Yeah,
before.
I mean, again, editing was not a huge priority
Right.
at that point. I was just like finding my voice on the page, doing what I could in that sense. But
Right.
it's you have to be resilient with it. And granted, there are writers out here who've been doing it for 20 years and never had their name on a one sheet, never had anything ostensibly produced.
Right.
That's a tough way to live, man. I mean, ultimately, you want to see your stuff, you want to be credited for it, you want to get the calls the next day. And you want to be that guy, but it's also bizarre because there are situations of writers that I know who have been sole credited on something who haven't done the work, and they get that. I couldn't imagine getting that call the next day and going like, God, you did such a great job on that movie.
Right.
Congratulations on the opening. There's got to be some distance to that, but it's also the strange rules that no one really understands about the WGAW arbitration process. So ultimately you do your job and you hope that you get credit if you want it, and you hope you don't if you don't. There's a project that I won't name that's shooting right now at New Line that I purposely, when I handed in the script, I took my name off it. I didn't want my name on the script regardless. So everybody's like, "Why?" I mean, it's a huge insult, granted, but I just didn't want my name near the thing, and
But you took their money anyway.
But I did take their money, and I used it for hookers and 8-ball. No, I'm just,
Do you ever bail on a spec that you're writing in the middle, just thinking this isn't worth completing or it's not gonna work?
Sometimes, yeah. For me, it's passion, man. The worst thing, if I'm finding that I'm flagging in that sense, it's why I say when I hop onto a project, people have heard me say that I'm never going to drop the ball on a project. What I mean by that, and it's not an endorsement of like arrogance. What it really is a statement of humility, because I know what I can and can't execute. I'm very familiar with what my limitations are, and it comes down to one thing, and that's passion. If I'm passionate about something, if I'm obsessed with it, I'm type A by nature. If I'm getting up in the morning thinking about those characters, if they're on my mind when I drive, if they're doing all those things, then that fits the criteria. If I'm working on a spec on my own, or hopefully not a project, where I'm tired with the characters, I don't like them. Somebody the other day said, I met with a director and they were talking about the problem with the script as it is now, and he said, and I thought it was a very acute statement, he said, I could tell that the writer doesn't like the characters. And I think you have to love the characters, whether it be the bad ones or the good ones. There has to be a love that comes through, and I really didn't think of it until he said that. But I think it's a crucial part. You've got to love your characters, and it's the harder part, to go back to your question about rewriting and the difference between being the first in. It's hard to come in with that level of love. You know, there's a certain promiscuity to it at that point. Somebody's already been with this person, so so it's, and you weren't the first in, and it's like anything else. There are only two good analogies in the world. And it's basically girls and sports.
So is that the most difficult part of writing a screenplay for you, like falling in love with the characters and seeing
no, it's the key. I mean, I don't know that it's difficult. It's the best part, the early part, when you're particularly on a spec. Like I have a general rule that I have to fill up 2 legal pads full of random stuff, scenes sometimes, dossiers. I'll write a complete dossier on a character, most of which will never find its way into a movie, but just so I know who he or she is. And I think those are the fun parts. That's where you're coming up with the beats, with the movie moments, if you will, more times than not. They come out of that embryonic stage, that early stage, the flirtation. It's like a relationship.
What's the best thing you feel you've ever written?
It's not Longest Yard. I mean, one of my favorites is a script called By Virtue Fall, which we had sold on spec, and then actually we took back. I gave the money back, just because it was sort of for whatever reason, it's the first script I wrote that actually really made me cry. Which again sounds incredibly pretentious or pansy-like, but
you're in touch with your emotions.
Yeah, clearly, right? That was probably the one. Yeah, and hopefully I haven't written it yet.
Where do you find your inspiration?
Anywhere. I mean, that's the beauty of, for me, it's often music. It's that script came about through By Virtue Fall, through my favorite quote, which is a Shakespeare script, some rise by sin, some by virtue fall. That just connected with me. I can always tell you what music I was listening to when I was writing a script, because I love music, and that's often a source of where it comes from. I won't listen to music when I'm writing, but when I'm driving, when I'm doing anything that's sort of seemingly leisurely or anything like that, when you're thinking, I think all too often now, we as a society train ourselves to not have time to think. You get home, you turn the TV on. You get in the car, you turn the radio on. You do whatever it is. I think often those moments come in solitude, when you find that inspiration, or it's themes, and I accept that, like, you don't want to put somebody in a situation to go down the hall and tell Amy Pascal that Sheldon Turner has some wonderful themes he wants to explore in this movie. But I think that's what makes for really good, even in something like Longest Yard, which is, pablum and fun movie and all that. You gotta, at least for me, I've got to know what the themes are. Even something like Redemption, whatever it is, that's what makes interesting movies. I think if you're just writing for page 33, I've got to hit the point where the star-crossed lovers meet the giant giraffe. Then it's gonna feel like that. It's gonna read like that on the page, and it's gonna come across like that on the screen. So there are always things that I want to get out. Commentary, whatever they might be. Granted, some people might pick up on them. That's again what great movies. I think the good movies do well and do good and appeal to a 14-year-old sense of TNA or guns or whatever it might be, and appeal to a 28-year-old doctoral candidate's view of looking for something a little meatier.
Is there a theme right now that you're obsessing about?
Jesus.
Stopped you cold.
Yeah, you got me on that one. There's not really. I mean, I think disconnection is a big one that I tend to explore, because again, it goes back to that sort of that view of society being this paradox of having all these ways to communicate, and we're all on our Blackberries and we're all doing these things, and yet try to have a conversation with somebody, and it's really difficult, man. We are absolutely becoming less and less articulate. So there's something interesting about that, of seeing a city like a New York and overflowing with people, and yet being so lonely. It's sort of the Hamlet of cities. LA's the same way. Like anything where, even in a room full of people, Hamlet was always viewed as, the lonely warrior, if you will. And by the way, if you really want to be pretentious, you make a quote about Hamlet. I find that very effective.
Way to work in Shakespeare.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. Oh, was that Shakespeare?
Do you have a main source of inspiration, or is it different with every project?
I think it changes with every project. Primarily, music is usually a big source of things. Sometimes it's a movie I've seen. Sometimes it's a documentary, whatever it might be. Sometimes it's a conversation I've had with somebody. It can be one of many things. The commonality is usually like there's music involved in some capacity. Inspiration's everywhere, though. It's just about being open to it, I think.
We've got something to inspire you. We've reached the point in the
strippers.
we have a storytelling exercise that we call the object, and
it's horrible.
Let me get Norris in here on the tray. Norris.
Well, now I'm really frightened.
So this is the way this works.
Okay.
We're going to reveal an object to you. You're going to tell us its story.
Okay.
And then after that, you're going to tell us how you arrived at that story. And other than that, there are no limitations.
Fantastic.
Are you ready?
Who came up with this? Was this you, Mike?
I'm not at liberty to say. That's for us to know and you to find out.
I want to know who to talk to about this thing.
But are you ready? I don't want to jump the gun.
No, I'm ready. Let's get this thing on.
Your object, sir.
Spooky.
Only talk out loud when you have something to say. You don't have to rush.
Okay. All right, the story behind these. John Romano, prosecuting attorney, first case, decides, I want to be perceived by a jury as a little more intelligent. Essentially has a pair of glasses that he pulls out. There's no glass in them. They're clear. But he wears them with the jury for that moment when he can take them off and go, what I do know about this case. And John Romano lost the case horribly afterwards and held largely responsible these glasses and smashed them afterwards as a memento of what not to do in the future. And he keeps them in his office as a reminder. So there's that little moment in the movie when he goes, why do you have a pair of broken glasses on your shelf? And he tells that story again.
No, that's very interesting. You gravitated towards a story about failure.
Yeah. Again, common motivator in the fear of failure and all the rest. I mean, I think ultimately in arriving at something, it's again the difference between being a mechanical writer and an instinctive writer. I think for the most part, things are instinctive for me.
That was fairly detailed for coming up on the spur of the moment. I mean,
it's also being really gifted in the art of bullshit. I mean, I think that's, we joke, but sort of like when I was in law school, the second year we had moot court session, and it's a big deal. You go before, appellate court justices, and you present your case. And in my case, we went up, and there was a defense case. There was a big criminal case. So and I was fairly confident with it, overconfident. And I stayed out late the night before and showed up for this thing at 8:30 and gave what I thought was a very cogent, commanding performance, sat back down and, thanks very much. And one of the appellate court justices, who's invariably always mentioned as a potential Supreme Court nominee, got up and said, I found counselors' arguments very persuasive. I also found them incredibly content void. So for the rest of law school, that became my nickname, content void. Yeah. So Yeah, it's a skill, though. I think the art of bullshit is a necessary thing because ultimately, like those things you pick up in conversations, the stories. I was sitting down with an executive, one of the great, and I love this guy immediately. I walked in, I had a great meeting with him, but the first thing I noticed was there was an obscure movie poster on the wall.
Right.
And I looked up at it and I made a comment about it. He didn't say anything. We had literally a 2-hour meeting. We're talking about our fathers, our relationships to them, all the rest. And at one point, when he felt comfortable enough with me, he said, "Let me tell you about that movie poster. I met my dad one day in my life. And the day that he came to see me, he brought a football and he took me to go see that movie."
Wow.
To me, that was like the coolest story. You know, things like that you can take from an experience. I'm still trying to find the way. And now, of course, I've said it on camera. I'm sure Ted Griffin will use it in his next script. But it's those moments, I think, finding that inspiration. It's the stories that people tell you that, you know, that you can doctor, you can take as a source of something.
Does your story about the broken glasses come from anything personal experience in the past, or?
It comes from my fascination with the sort of perception of intellect. And like I always thought I probably could boost my perceptual IQ at least 30 points if I needed glasses or brought props as glasses, so that sort of thing. You know, and the sort of things we were talking about earlier is the expectation things like this person's smart if he has this, if he does that. That's sort of the root of it. And I did used to think in law school, like, God, maybe I should use props, you know? Like, God damn, you know? And all those things. So that's sort of the germination of it.
Well, whenever I see a lawyer on TV with the pompadour hair or this crazy suit, you feel like they're going for their version of the first page that catches your attention.
Totally. It's just that great moment. It's the thing about glasses. When you just peel off the glasses, there it is, you know? Like you're making that appeal. Anything you could use to sort of simulate sincerity, I think it's not a bad thing, you know? Which is why the next time I pitch anything out, I'm bringing glasses with me. And if it doesn't sell, I'm smashing them.
Is there one piece of wisdom that pertains to screenwriting that you just can't hear enough, that you feel is an overriding piece of wisdom that everyone should know about screenwriting?
You know, more or less, I think in terms of things that I debunk as the sort of classics, the things that people tell you, write about what you know. You know what? If I wrote about what I knew, it'd be the most boring scripts in history. You know, I mean, I think there are emotional connections that you have, things that you can identify with, but. For the most part, if you write about what you know, it's why there are people out there who say, like, this is the most amazing script. You're too close to it, for one. Because that moment when you went away to summer camp and Joey had that accident on the boat, nobody really gives a shit. You know, it's important to you because it was a seminal moment. And it'll come across that way maybe on a script, but in a bigger sense, it doesn't resonate like that. So that's a fallacy, I always thought. To me, it's just keep writing and read everything you can get your hands on. And I do believe that writers are born. I think you can make yourself better as a writer. I think you can take all the courses you want if you don't have it in you. If you don't have that voice in your head, I always say screenwriters are schizophrenics. The only difference is rather than talking back to the voices, you write them down. And I think that's kind of the way, like, truly there is a torturous content to it, absolutely, and it's a bit of a myth. But there's also a sense of there are stories in that you just have to tell. And at the end of the day, whether you're a director or producer or anything in the film industry, you have to love stories. You have to love the process. I have a father who's one of the great storytellers. So that was sort of the root of it, and seeing the way people reacted to him. And telling stories in any shape or form, whether it be in front of someone or whether it be on the page, that's the route I think you play to. You know?
Do you have a particular fear about being a screenwriter? Is there anything about it that makes you anxious to this day?
Always. I mean, I think there's a scary part. There should be fear, a healthy fear to starting a new script. I mean, ultimately, everything boils down to fear of embarrassment, fear of humiliation. I don't necessarily think about that because I think there are people who should be embarrassed by some of the things they've written that are not. So I don't think that necessarily plays into it. I think that part of the reason people are drawn to Hollywood is because it's largely devoid of that sense of sort of prejudging anything. There's this permissive attitude, for better or worse.
And you can reinvent yourself how many times over?
Every 2 months, reinvent yourself. You know, so I don't think it's that necessarily kind of fear. I think it's a fear of disappointing myself. I mean, ultimately, I'm my hardest critic. And I know when I didn't deliver on something, and I know because it's such an important part of my life, it's going to impact everything that day, that month, that year. You know, I mean, it's the good news and bad news about obsessing about something. When I feel like I haven't done my job, then it sort of impacts everything. It's on my head. I feel like a failure, a disappointment, all those things. It is that self-loathing. I joke about it, but there's a certain semblance of, by identifying so closely your self-esteem with the work that you've been doing. It's a precipitous slope, man. It's a dangerous thing, but that's probably the extent of the fear. Beyond, like, look, if you're waiting for validation, and I know Hollywood's founded on validation, like validate me. But if you're, as a screenwriter, if that's what you're looking for, then you got a problem. You're gonna absolutely be heartbroken. You know, hopefully I make myself happy and the people that I trust and love and respect. hopefully they follow suit. Because, ultimately you don't want the sicko fans that are going to be there and go.
Right.
I mean, I've given stuff to people that I know is really raw and not there yet, and I've had people tell me it's great.
Right.
And I know they're full of shit. I don't want that. I want to hear like, this you missed on, you didn't do that. Certainly there's a way to present it.
Sure.
That's not the way Ivan Reitman would or something.
Right.
But ultimately that's sort of that's an invaluable thing. You've got to hear that, because I think all too often, especially as actors, it's common, but I think screenwriters even, there with agents or anything else, I'm blessed that I have an agent. I have people in my life who give me the straight dope, man, and that's why I love them and that's why I respect them, because I know that they're not going to sugarcoat anything.
Right.
They're not going to, because I think ultimately as an artist, when you hit something, when you didn't, and you want to hear that feedback for it. You know, so there are all these tests that I think intentionally or instinctively go on.
Do you have a working screenwriter today that's kind of like that you find inspiration in, or whose work you really admire?
I mean, there are some great, like the lions of the trade, if you will. There's the Atanasio's, there's Eric Roth, there's all those guys that I just like, whatever they write, I want to read.
Right.
And what you learn though also is even those guys, everybody drops a ball once in a while.
Right.
And which is good. It takes a little bit of pressure off, because look, you do it long enough, there are people who are gonna see you as dropping the ball on a project. Well, what's too bad is every once in a while you read one of those lions, and it just reads like they're phoning it in, And I don't know if it's a function of money or anything else, but I always say as soon as I start writing strictly for money, I'm a hack, man.
Right.
As soon as and look, I've taken jobs strictly for the money in the past. I think it shows on the page. I think ultimately you can't conceal those sorts of things. It has to be something that I'm always going to want to write on spec, So.
Right.
And I think actually that's an important note to make, because I think if you work in the studio systems too long, independent of your criteria or perspective, I think you lose a certain voice. There are certain writers in town who studios love because they're easy to rewrite, because they don't have a voice. I mean, I think good writing, ideally I endeavor for somebody to pick up my script and tear the cover page off and read something and know that it's me. The same way it's what I love about music. I can turn on the radio and hear a Tom Morello guitar solo and know it's Audioslave, or know it's old Rage Against the Machine, whatever it is.
Right.
There's a definition of that. There's an instinct that if you want to write like everybody else, then I'm sure there's a place for you.
Right.
But I think ultimately that voice has to be not dissimilar to sitting down with somebody and having a meal with them and liking them.
Right.
There's a personality that I think should come through on the page. And sometimes, look, I have all the time producers or executives tell me to take that stuff out. But I think, and I will sometimes, but I think it makes for interesting reading. It's also kind of the sham of writing. Sometimes I'll read scripts that are really entertaining in the action and all that. But ultimately, it doesn't add up. There are people who write great scripts and bad movies, and there are people that write amazing movies and bad scripts. All the time I'll read a script and go, God, I didn't like it. I'll go see the movie. God, I loved it. And I'll go back, God, I want to see how they changed so much in it. It's the same damn thing.
Right.
It just didn't pop the way, and it's about, I think, honing your sort of eye for those things, your eye and ear, to recognizing, okay, maybe that doesn't have the finesse, it doesn't have the savvy, that's the sizzle that maybe sometimes is sold, but it has the steak, and it's about differentiating between the two. Ideally, you have both the steak and the sizzle, in a perfect world.
Right. Now, give me an example of a movie that played great, but that you know that the script wasn't.
I'll actually give you the same writer, and I think he got. Reading American History X, I was not fond of the script.
Right.
I saw the movie, I liked it very much, and amazingly enough, I read Get Carter, a draft that David McKenna, the same writer, had written, and I liked the script a lot, and the movie did not live up to it. So it's one of those things,
So execution can obviously screw up a great script.
Totally, and it's about being able to differentiate. Look, it's always better to have the sizzle, but it's also knowing that you didn't get brought in by the sizzle when ultimately at the end of it, you're like, God, that was so well written and interesting, but would it make an interesting movie? There's a difference between those two.
Are the writers just brutalized in the filmmaking process? Are they ever given the proper respect or deference? Or
it's a little bit of a cliche to sit around and talk about how we don't get our due and this and that. I get why we don't. I get why we don't in the sense of what would you rather read, an Entertainment Weekly article about Adam Sandler, about the guy who wrote the movie?
Right.
Ultimately, my mom maybe wouldn't even read the article about me. So I understand from that perspective, getting the due. I mean, are we talking financial? Maybe there's a way to up that. I mean, I think ultimately most of us make a very good living and are blessed to do it. There's a point where you sort of lose perspective of that, and you're fighting about monetary issues, and you go, my God, that's more than my dad made in 2 years. So it's always about keeping things in perspective. Again, that tends to go towards ego. If we're talking about access, yeah, I mean, I think screenwriters should have more access to the process, and I think that falls on producers having the respect to do it. it's so easy, man, because let's face it, we're the lions, man, walking around with our paws with thorns in it. All you have to do as a producer, as an executive, is take that goddamn thorn out. It's that simple. It really is, because no one else does it. And we all remember, man. I remember when people roll calls to me, all the little things that producers and execs think that people don't pick up on.
Right.
Let me tell you, the best thing you can do as an exec, as a producer, as anything, is pick up the goddamn phone, don't roll it, and say, hey, Sheldon, it's Mike, how are you? You know?
Right.
Start those little things, because writers have nothing else to do all day but sit home and masturbate and think about how people are disrespecting us. Those things are recognized. And I think the smart producers know to play to that.
So you'd actually leave the house and not masturbate to go hang out with an executive?
I masturbate in the room with executives on the page now. But those are the things that I think that smart executives tap into, because knowing that we're sort of perceived in a self-actualization way or in a real way as being unrecognized, not getting our due, unmerited, then there's a great opportunity, I think, to get that, because we are loyal creatures.
Does the outside world contribute to that? Do you think the outside world has an idea of what role the writers play?
Yeah, I think there was an actress that read one of my scripts and was like, yeah, but that was based on a book. It's not really, like, he didn't really write it, Like, the book had nothing to do with, like, there was maybe 7% of the book in that screenplay, but I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of that. I mean, I love actors because I have respect for what they do. I think the great relationships in that sense are actors and writers or directors, because they understand what goes into the process. I think when it seems so abundant, when you bring home 20 scripts, you're like, wow, they're everywhere. What do I, But when you really respect, like, a well-written script and what goes into the process, I just think most people don't think about that. And I think that's sort of a process that even if you don't believe it, at least act like you do. I mean, I sat down with a director the other day who was talking about how much he loves writers. It's actually a funny side footnote, because he kept talking about, like, I could never write, I love what you guys do, this and that. And he was talking about a couple projects he had. So one of which he gave me, and I looked and it said revisions by this director's name. And then another one, he went into this 20-minute pitch about this particular project, his heart, his blood, passion project. And then I said, well, when are you getting that script? And he goes, I'll be done in about a week on it. So I was like, dude, for somebody who hates writing, you're doing a lot of it. And then I later found out that he tried to go and get credit on a project that he had directed, and so there's certain things like that. We can usually tell when someone's bullshitting, but I think for the most part, if you give respect to writers, it's the easiest ones to win over. I think actors that I know, they're inherently suspicious of it, because everybody kisses their ass. No one really does that with writers, and the ones that do, it's probably smart from a standpoint if you wanted that seminar for how to get the one untapped resource into Hollywood on your side. The people that I'm loyal to are the people that have done that. And yes, part of it is curtailing and appealing to my ego, but it's also the people that at least ostensibly recognize the writing process,
How do you feel about the film buy credit? I know there's controversy over directors taking a film buy, even if it's their first film or it's,
It's a little ridiculous. I mean, I think it should be earned in the sense of, look, Chris Nolan, even though he hasn't done that many movies, he's earned it. I mean, he's definitely an auteur. He writes a lot of his things. He's involved in that sense. There's a merit to it. But the reflex of, hey, I'm doing my first film I want to film by, and I didn't write the project.
Friday the 13th, Part 7, a film by.
Yeah,
whatever.
It's a little ridiculous, And I think it's overkill, and I think it plays to ego too, because I think more times than not, when I talk to attorneys, when I talk to my attorney about the stuff that they deal with, the minutia, a lot of it's about that. Like, where's my name going to go on the goddamn
Well, that's how
credit
studios
thing,
look for that kind of catnip to throw.
That's exactly it.
Or directors in lieu of money. So
and I understand it. Ultimately, one of the things my dad taught me is, like, he wouldn't necessarily give raises to people, but he'd give them new titles, which I always thought was great. Like, now you can be the executive janitor, whatever it is. What does that play to? Ego. Ultimately, ego trumps even money on things, and I think that's the way you appeal to a lot of things, whether it be writers or whether it be executives or directors, whatever it is. Give them that. I understand that from a standpoint of selling. What I don't understand is, like, someone right out of the gate. You shouldn't need that incentive,
Do you find most of the time you get along with the directors once they're hired, that your role isn't diminished or ended when they come in?
Absolutely. I mean, I think for the most part, directors are those creatures that do understand the what goes into the writing process. And I think by nature, what's interesting is more times than not, I'll sit down with directors and they also say the same thing, which is, I don't know a lot of people that do what you do, which is unbelievable to me, because that's the one relationship. It's one of the things that I love about that an agent can do, that an effective agency can do, that mine does, that I love so much, is make those relationships, because ultimately as an artistic community, that's what it should thrive on. I mean, that's why the best moments for me have been sitting down with an actor or a director and riffing on things, because ultimately executives attack it from a different standpoint, and it's also about aligning forces. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Longest Yard got made because Adam and Jack were there and they were 800-pound gorillas and no one was going to deny that. I mean, the story that I always tell is the first draft that we all went in with was, we went through a bunch of, probably 10 drafts on it. We went into the studio. I remember sitting in Jack's office. We're on the speakerphone with one of the execs on it. And he just got the script, and what do you think of it? And by the way, 85% of what's on the screen was in that script.
Right.
He goes, I think it's okay. I mean, there's a few things I'd want to change. And Jack, to his credit, maybe deny it now, goes, you're an idiot, hangs up on the guy, goes, I'm sending it to Sherry. She was the head of the studio at the time. And sure enough, cut to next day, literally 24 hours later, we're all in the same spots on the couch, speakerphone, same exec. I love it. It's fantastic. We got a green light that day. So of course he had to fall in line. But what I mean by that is, like, the good producers, the ones you want to be in business with, don't listen to that bullshit. They try to be the image makers, and the bad situations I've been in. I have written scripts better than Longest Yard. And I had one early on that I had written that I had a producer who just sort of, like, we went through 15 drafts on, to me, was incredibly passionate, but I know he sold me out. Because ultimately, when it came to have those fights, when the moment came down to the exec saying, I don't know, he didn't do what Jack did. He didn't go, you're an idiot, and we're going to get this thing made. And that's what I think good movie making is, because nobody knows. Ultimately, you've got to be stubborn. You've got to be stupid to the point of brazen, just like that kind of thing, passion in anything is what's going to get you through, even to the point of being pathological about it. I think those are the personalities. If you're looking for commonality, this is not the business. If you're looking to be mediocre, then fine. Then it's why ultimately I talk about why I have to get up when I do, because that's not things that common people do. Anything I can do to differentiate myself from the thousands of other writers out there, I'm going to do. Whether it be walking in a room and being in better shape, anything. Whatever that thing is, I need every edge I can get, man. So I'm going to find it.